So lesson 9.5, we're going to be looking at the quadratic formula. Big idea says if an equation can be put into this form that we've been looking at, ax squared plus bx plus c, it can be solved using the quadratic formula. So we're going to be solving these. We found that there were certain times that if we wanted to find out what x was in an equation, if we knew what y was, that we didn't know how to do it algebraically. We could look at a graph and we could see if we drew the line y equals 5, where does the equation or function hit it? And using our calculator, we could find those 2 points and solve it. But how do we solve it algebraically when there's a squared with a variable and an x? How do we actually solve that out? So we're going to take a look at putting things in what's called standard form and then using the quadratic formula to solve for x. And we're going to be square rooting things, and there's going to be multiple answers. So let's jump right in. The standard form of a quadratic equation is the one we're used to, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the key is here that all of these terms, the coefficient with the x squared, the coefficient with the x, and the number that's by itself, are all going to be on one side of the equation, and so that means nothing's left on the other side, so it's going to say equals 0. If it's not in this form, we can't use the quadratic formula. So we're going to always have to move things into this form if they're not there. So here is the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times ac over 2a. And this is super important. You will use this forever, all the way up through all of your math classes. This will come back, and it's something that you're going to just have to memorize. And it's something that, I've memorized multiple times, and I always have to go back and make sure I can kind of remember it, but I'm always a little weary about, is it negative b and where's the b squared? Okay, so it's something you'll come back to and you'll have to memorize when you need it, but it's going to be used over and over and over. So before we can use this, again, we need to know how to get these things into standard form. And what we need to do, if you take a look, here's an a and a b and a c. Once we have things in standard form, we're going to take these numbers that are sitting in the a and the b and the c spot, and we're going to plug them into this quadratic formula and then just solve it, and they're going to tell us what x equals. Because if you tried to solve this by itself, get x by itself, think about it. How do I get x by itself? Well, I've got an x squared and an x. I can't put those together. So I could get one of them by themselves. I could move everything away. But now I'm going to have x equals something x squared. And how do you solve that? Well, this is how you're going to solve it. You're going to use the quadratic formula. There's another way called factoring, which we'll get into as well. But right now, today, we're just focused on how do we use the quadratic formula. And this will work for every single situation. We're factoring in some of the other ways that you're going to use to solve equations in the future. Quadratic equations, they really only work ideally in certain situations, where this works in all of them. All right, so we're going to rewrite these in standard form, which means get them where everything's on the left side equals 0. So right here on this one, everything's good except this 8x is on the right side of the equal sign. So we need to move it. So just like we always move it, we're going to minus it. You're going to bring it over here. Now, it doesn't really matter where you put it on the left side in terms of lining it up, because it's not going to come away from this. You can't combine an x and an x squared. And you can't combine these because this doesn't have an x. So it's literally just coming over to this side. So the right side clears out. So it's 0. And that's what we're trying to get. And then this side just stays in a line. So it's 12x squared minus 8x minus 10. And that's it. We're in standard form. So we now have an a, b, and a c. And if we wanted to solve for x and find out what is x equal here, we could use the quadratic formula. So what's a? A would be 12. B would be negative 8. The minus counts as a negative. And c would be negative 10. So for this problem, we're not going to do anything with that. But that's how you would have to rearrange it in order to get these numbers. So a lot of people would look at this and say, well, here's my x, so that's my b. So b is positive 8. But it's actually negative 8 because you got to get it on the other side. So there's ways to look ahead and kind of see this, where you're going to go with a, b, and c. But to pull the a, b, and c, you have to have it in this form. So same thing here. We want everything on, we'll say, the left side. And so all of this has to go away. So I'm going to go ahead and minus 10x squared. And we're getting more proficient with this. We can do more than one thing at once. We know this 7's got to come over too. So to get rid of the 7, I'm going to add 7. And think about where that's going to line up. That's going to be lined up right here. So don't forget, this can get a little confusing. if you do something on the right side, you have to do it on the left side. So when you start trying to line this up, the equal sign is your barrier. So if you add 7 on the right side of the equal sign, you got to do it once over here too. It's not always going to combine with something like over here. It just sits on the other side. But there are times, if there's a like term, that we can combine it. So on the right side, everything cleared out. These are gone, so it's 0. And on this side, we're going to combine this. Okay, and that's a 5x squared. 9x didn't combine with anything, so it stays. And negative 3 plus 7 is a positive 4. And so from this, I can pull an A, a B, and a C. This is now in standard form. A is 5, B is 9, and C is 4. And so if I wanted to plug into my quadratic formula, I could do so. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start practicing that. So this one you can see is already in standard form, and they just want us to solve it. What is x? How do I solve for x? So you could try and get x by itself, but again, you've got a squared and an x. So you're only going to be able to isolate one of them, and the other one's going to be on the other side, and you're not going to be able to do anything with it. So we have to use the quadratic formula here. So we need an A, a B, and a C. So A is 4, and B is negative 12, and C is negative 135. Okay, so I'm going to start by writing out my equation here. So x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And the more times you write it, the easier it is to memorize it. So now let's go ahead and plug in. So first of all, b is negative 12. So this is going to be negative b. So it's going to be negative 12. So if this was a positive number you plugged in for b, it's not going to be negative. But since it's a negative 12 you're plugging in, the two negatives actually cancel. So this becomes a positive 12 plus or minus square root of b squared. So b is negative 12. I'm going to make sure I put it in parentheses because when you square it, remember when you put it in your calculator, you got to have parentheses because this will be positive. Negative 12 squared is a positive number. Minus 4 times a times c. So 4 times a is 4 times c is negative 135. I'm going to extend this. And on the bottom, it's just 2 times a, so 2 times 4. All right, so what we want to do is we want to simplify this. We're going to get an answer inside here and square root it. We're going to get an answer on the bottom. And then all we have to do is add and divide and then subtract and divide. So when you see this plus or minus, it actually means you're going to do two different things. And the reason is because when we square root something, remember there's always two answers. Square root of 100 could be 10 or it could be negative 10. Square root of 9 could be 3 or negative 3. So we have to account for both. And so that's why we have the plus and the minus here. All right, so I'm going to bring this down here. I'm going to leave the 12. So we can go ahead and put most of this in our calculator. Let's go ahead and do that. So I want to simplify this bottom part right here. So negative 12 in parentheses squared minus 4 times negative 135. Okay, and it did all of it for me. So if you're careful with your parentheses, you can certainly just plug all of that in. And so underneath here, I have 2,304. And on the bottom, I had 2 times 4, so that's 8. Okay, I need to take the square root of that now. So I'm going to hit second square root. You can type it in or scroll up and hit it. And the square root is not always going to work out nicely, but in this case it does, is 48. And so as I move this over, I need to simplify this. So it's 12 plus or minus. The square root of this we just found was 48 divided by 8. And so basically now I'm going to break this into two separate problems. I need to do 12 plus 48 divided by 8 and 12 minus 48. So two separate ones. So I'm going to put one over here. It's going to be 12 plus 48 divided by 8. And then one over here is 12 minus 48 divided by 8. And again, the reason is because when I take the square root of 2,304, the square root's not just positive 48, it's also negative 48, because negative 48 times negative 48 will become a positive 2,304. So I have to account for both of them. So it could have been a positive 48 where I'm adding, it could have been a negative 48 where I'm subtracting. So this will account for both of them. So I'm going to go ahead and add up here, and I'm going to get 60 over 8, and I'll divide that in a second. And 12 minus the 48 is going to get me negative 36 divided by 8. All right, so let's go ahead and run the numbers here. These are going to be your two solutions. So x is going to equal both of these numbers. So if I do 60 divided by 8, that's 7.5. So x can be 7.5. Or the other answer, negative 36 divided by 8 is negative 4.5. And so x equals both of these numbers. Both of these are possible solutions. And so I always have to remember to do the plus and the minus because the square root can be positive or negative. All right, so let's flip it over to the back, jump into another one here. And this one you'll find different because it's not in standard form. So the very first thing we need to do is rewrite this into standard form. So that's why we practiced it early on here. So I need this to be a 0 over here. So I'm going to go ahead and add 5 to get rid of it. And now it's going to say equals 0. This is not going to combine with anything. And I'm going to go ahead and rearrange this and put everything in the right order. So I'm going to put the 5x squared up front. Then I'm going to put the 10x. It's positive, so I put plus. And I added this 5 to get it over here, so it's a plus 5. So from that, now I have an A, a B, and a C. A is 5, and B is 10, and C is also 5. So it really is beneficial to put this in order because the A can't just be some random first term. It has to be the x squared coefficient. And B has to be the coefficient of just the x. And C is going to be the number by itself. So ideally, you want to have this in order in this form. All right, so again, quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So let's go ahead and plug in. Negative b would be, you plug in 10, and so it's negative 10. B squared, so 10 squared, minus 4 times a times c, so 4 times 5, which is a times c times 5 again. And that's all divided by 2 times a, so 2 times 5. So let's go ahead and simplify. I know on the bottom here I'm going to have a 10. I'm still going to have a negative 10 out here, plus or minus, square root. Let's go ahead and get the number on the inside here. So I'm going to do 10 squared minus 4 times 5 times 5. That's 0. So I get 0 in here. And so now square root of 0 is just 0. So negative 10 plus or minus 0 divided by 10. Well, this technically splits into two pieces, but you can start thinking about what's going to happen here. It's going to be negative 10 plus 0 divided by 10. And it's going to be negative 10 minus 0 divided by 10. But either way, in this case, you're going to get the same thing, negative 10 over 10. So I don't need to give the same answer twice. I only need one of these. The only times I need to give two answers is if there's two different answers. So the answer here is just x equals negative 1. One solution. So in this case, there was one solution. If you go back over here, clearly there was two solutions. And let's see what happens on the last one. Okay, so first of all, this is not in standard form, so let's get it there. We need to get this 3 on the other side. So we're going to minus 3. As I look at this side, the only thing that can combine with is the 10, so I'm going to put it under there. I've got 0 on this side now. I'm going to put this in the right order as well as combine my like terms. So 12x squared up front minus 5x. And then these are going to combine for my regular number, and the 10 minus 3 is a plus 7. All right, my A is 12, my B is negative 5, and my C is 7. All right, so if I write this down, negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4 times a times c over 2 times a. Let's go ahead and plug in. So negative b. b is already negative, so a negative negative 5 becomes a positive 5, plus or minus b squared, so negative 5 squared minus 4 times 12 times 7. And on the bottom, it's 2 times a, so 2 times 12. So I'm going to bring this down. I've got 5 plus or minus square root. We'll handle that in a second. And on the bottom, I'm going to have 24. So let's plug all this in. So I'm going to solve the inside here. Negative 5 squared. And if you know that's 25, you can just write 25. Minus 4 times 12 times 7. And I get negative 311. Now, you may go try and do that, and some of you are thinking ahead maybe. But you can't square root a negative. Error, right? You can't do it because any number times itself is going to create a positive number. So a square root is asking what number times itself gives you negative 311. Well, even if you had a negative number, a negative times a negative is a positive. And a positive times a positive is a positive. And even 0, which is neither positive or negative, times itself is 0. So you're never going to square something and get a negative. Okay, so let's write that down. You cannot square root negative. And so this is one of those special cases which we've dealt with before. There is no solution. So just like everything we've done before, there is the possibility of no solution. There's possibility of one solution. We're not looking at any situations where there's all real numbers. So you're either going to get 2 answers because you plus or minus. It is possible just to get 1 answer. But then there's also the chance there's no solution. So if you end up with a negative inside here, there's going to be no solution. Now you need to be careful. Here's what's going to happen. Some of you are going to square this number and you're not going to be careful with your parentheses. And it's going to create a negative 25 instead of a positive 25 in another problem. And then you're going to end up with a negative in here and you're going to say there's no solution. But there actually is. And you're going to be like, how come I got no solution? It's because when you squared this, you left it negative. Remember, anything squared creates a positive. But even with that, when we multiplied all these numbers, this squared is positive 25, but when you minus all of this number is going to be bigger than 25, and so it created a negative. And so you can't square root a negative. There's no solution.